We have one more presentation before our afternoon break. I would like to welcome Amani Bell, our Equity Fellow, to talk about her fellowship titled Addressing Placement Inequities Through Participatory Action Research. Thank you, Amani.
Right. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, everyone. This is the beautiful yarning circle here on campus on Whadjuk Noongar country. We are always learning and we're always on country. And I wanted to acknowledge that I live on Kiamai land over in Sydney, and I work on Gadigal land, and that we all come here from our different lands. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and future, and my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So what was my fellowship about? So my fellowship is about placements, so work-based placements, which are a form of work-integrated learning, where students in their in many degrees, so medicine, allied health, teaching, social work, vet science, they need to do compulsory placements. They're usually full-time, and they impose financial hardships on students known as placement poverty. Students also sometimes encounter racism, ableism, and other forms of discrimination when they're on their placements, and that further impacts their well-being. So as a consequence, students might drop out of their degrees or defer their degrees, and they might enter the workforce already burnt out. So we know that there are so many benefits to workforce diversity, so it was something that I was really keen to tackle in this fellowship. So these were my aims. So to look at placement poverty, and to look at placement inclusion, and to do that via participatory action research with 4 student co-researchers and through a process of 4 co-design workshops. So it was really important that the project brought diverse perspectives and experiences, and that it included students. So I'm a higher education equity researcher, and I also work teaching placement subjects in health sciences. I come from a minoritised ethnic and religious background. And then the 4 student co-researchers, and I'll say them in order that you see in the photo, Minahil Khan, Tina Tran, Tara Soanes and Lachlan Cyber. So Minahil's an international student studying dentistry, and Tina is a social work student, and she brings her perspectives of having a low socioeconomic status background, and also her experience of working as a mentor and ambassador for young people. And Tara is an arts and social work student and brings a social justice lens to the project. And Lachlan is a proud Kamilaroi man, as well as a teacher and as well as doing an honours degree in history. Just wanted to mention that these slides are all available at this link, and I think Anna might have put that into the chat for the people on Zoom as well. And I'll show this link a few times through the presentation, and if you do grab that link, you'll be able to see all of my speaking notes and some of the other links that are in the slides as well. So placement poverty has been in the media quite a bit over the past year or so, and it's been highlighting the impact of students, the impact on students when they lose their regular income and they often can't afford rent, food and other costs. Students also encounter limited availability of affordable rural accommodation, and these impacts are compounded and cumulative for students from equity deserving backgrounds. So we've been inspired in this project by student-led advocacy. So particularly Students Against Placement Poverty here in Australia has been instrumental in getting placement poverty into the media. And we've also been inspired by Paid Placements Aotearoa, that's led by Bex Howells, and she's recently completed her master's research on placement poverty. And here you can see her presenting a petition to the New Zealand government about paying students a universal stipend while they train in registered professions that have compulsory placements. So due to this advocacy and the Accord recommendations about placement poverty, the PRAC payments were announced in May last year. So from July this year, students studying teaching, social work, nursing and midwifery will receive a means-tested payment of a weekly amount of up to $319.50 while they're on their placements. So these PRAC payments are, of course, very welcome. However, many degrees with compulsory placements have missed out. So here we can see the campaign by the Australian Medical Students Association. So students studying medicine have more than 2,000 hours of placement during their degree. And there's maybe a false perception that those students can afford to do those unpaid placements. But what that means in reality is that it limits who can go into medicine in the first place. Similarly, allied health students missed out on the PRAC payments, and here we can see the Australian Council of Deans of Health Sciences getting this issue into the media. So turning now to our approach for the fellowship. During the first part of the fellowship, the project team conducted a scoping review on placement poverty in OECD countries and possible solutions. And our paper was accepted into the Journal of Higher Education Policy and Management, and it's available open access through that link. We've been inspired by two key concepts in this fellowship. So the first is work integrated learning for social justice. So which is based on Jan MacArthur's idea of assessment for social justice. So that's rooted in critical theory, and MacArthur's perspective highlights the connection between individual and social well-being. At the heart of this approach is the idea of mutual recognition. So the idea that individuals' identities, actions, and their intrinsic value. And MacArthur challenges us to reflect on students' lived experiences and question how can we make sure the conditions for equity-deserving students to thrive in work-integrated learning genuinely exist. Another concept we've drawn on is lived expertise. So the idea that people's experiences can develop into expertise that comes from sharing and reflecting on those experiences and connecting them to research and wider systemic issues. So together, those two concepts of work integrated learning for social justice and lived expertise have informed our methodology in the project, which was participatory action research. So that is a scholar activist research approach that brings together community members, activists and scholars to co-create knowledge and social change. And so in our next phase of the project, we hosted a series of 4 co-design workshops with students and educators from across Australia. So when I say educators, that's a broad term to mean people based at universities, but also people working on placement sites directly educating the students. So many participants contributed their expertise related to their research, practice and advocacy around placements and placement poverty and inclusion. So to make sure that these were accessible across Australia, we held them via Zoom. We repeated each workshop 3 times to allow a choice of time and allow for different time zones. And we were really fortunate to have participants from many disciplines and many universities. And we also had one person from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and one person from Canada who were invited particularly due to their expertise in placement poverty and inclusion. We didn't collect participant demographics, but many participants did disclose various aspects of their identities without prompting. So that included low socioeconomic status, Indigenous, international, culturally and linguistically diverse, LGBTQIA+, disability, neurodiversity, rural and regional, having caring responsibilities, minoritized religious beliefs, older students, and so on. And participants, of course, often belong to more than one of those groups, and they spoke about their intersectional experiences. So our first workshop aimed to establish the project and get to know each other. The participants introduced themselves and they shared sometimes deeply personal experiences of placement. And then we talked about two key questions. What are some solutions to placement poverty? And what are some solutions about placement exclusion? So having such a diverse range of participants allowed people to discuss their ideas collaboratively, and we generated a lot of solutions. That we then compiled those solutions, and there ended up being 20 around placement poverty and 20 about placement inclusion. And then we covered those in workshops 2 and 3 respectively. And we talked about how might those solutions work in practice? What are some barriers to those solutions and how can we overcome those barriers? And then in workshop 4, we discussed how we would communicate those solutions that we had co-developed and how we would like to stay in touch as a group. So in the workshop, we use collaborative tools like Padlet. That's just an example of part of one of the Padlets there. It's not necessarily to look in detail, but just to show you one of the tools that we used. And we also use Google Docs to collaboratively note take and develop solutions. But really our main approach was conversational. We didn't use any kind of formal methods of co-design. It was really more of a relational, conversational approach. So now I'll turn to the findings of the fellowship. So I'll just share some of the experiences of placement poverty that were shared by participants. So one student shared, I had to save the whole year to pay for my placement. We had a month of full-time placement. I raised that with the coordinator that I cannot financially afford not to work during this whole month. And I was told that the assumption for being enrolled in this program is that you can afford to not work for 2 years and be a committed full-time student. That comes from the sort of privilege that makes this whole degree completely not accessible for people coming from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Another student shared, I was skipping meals throughout the day. I would go to placement and just generally wouldn't bring food with me. And an educator pointed out the contextual factors that have really impacted placement poverty. Its cost of living, its housing crisis, its fees. The reality is that most students probably need to work close to full-time hours and they're trying to study close to full-time hours, and that just adds up to too many hours. As I mentioned before, we co-developed 20 solutions around placement poverty, which I've summarised into these themes. So the first is financial support. So that can range from a wage, a stipend, a bursary, or a scholarship. Sometimes these are tied to working for a particular employer for a number of years after graduation. And so this financial support can come from federal or state government, from university, or from employers. Another solution is to look at alternative degree models. So one is apprenticeship style degrees, which are more common in the UK. So these have paid placements, maybe they take a year longer, but the students can be paid while they're going through their degrees. Workshop participants also discussed alternative placement models. So one example is that students' current or prior experience should be able to count towards their placement hours and competencies. So their previous relevant vocational training, their volunteering, their caring, their current part-time work. There are some excellent initiatives where students' paid work can count towards their placements. So in New South Wales, there's a scheme where teaching students can complete and be paid for their final placement of their degree if that's in the school that they're already employed in. Another suggestion was just to generally reduce or subsidise the living costs of students on placement. So things like subsidised or free accommodation for rural placements or placements that are far from home, and food vouchers. Also, just overall reducing the cost of higher education would of course help alleviate placement poverty. So one example is increasing Commonwealth supported places for master's students. And participants suggested clear communication about placement costs well in advance of placements, maybe even before they start the degree. So especially things like hidden costs like parking, uniform, vaccinations, CPR training, all those kinds of things that they may not be aware of when they start the degree. I'll now turn to participants' experiences of placement exclusion. So one student shared, "My academic adjustment plans for disability always get declined when it comes to placement without even any discussion around it, because the idea is that's how industry works after your graduation and you should learn how to survive." Another student shared, "We're really losing out on diversity of students when supervisors don't understand the different ways people learn and produce work. I had my supervisor say at my final check-in, 'You just seem really bored.' And I was like, okay, that's a really strange thing to say because I don't think they realise that people with certain neurodivergences can show up inconsistently. And that doesn't mean they don't care about the placement. It just means they don't always show up the same way." Another student shared that, "I wish they would have more understanding. The amount of times I've had to go into placement and explain Ramadan to them, like I'm fasting, and obviously my energy levels in Ramadan are different than someone who's not fasting." And another student shared, "I'm non-binary and trans. It's difficult. Like in one placement, I emailed ahead just explaining who I am and these are my pronouns and some information about it. The response was awful. They said they would try to respect that, but the clients are from cultural and linguistic diverse backgrounds. They're not going to understand, so to be careful with who I tell. I couldn't bring my full safe self. I just had to mask it and just pretend everything was fine. If I'd been in a place that was really affirming and accepting, it would have been a very different experience." So I'll turn now to the solutions that we developed around placement exclusion. So participants recommended reflective sessions with an educator at least once a week while they're on placement to discuss any issues that they might be having, and also that peer mentoring was particularly helpful. Students are often uncomfortable speaking up when they do encounter exclusion when they're on placement. So workshop participants suggested the idea of someone who could advocate for them, because there are those real power dynamics with the educator is the person who can pass or fail them. Often they provide a reference letter as well. So it's a very tricky situation for students. Participants agreed that more mental health support is needed in universities, alongside providing students with some proactive preventative strategies to cope with stressful placement situations. Participants also recommended training for placement educators about inclusive practices, and that this should be built into, ideally, existing workplace training and also into university education, because our students are our future placement educators. In terms of curriculum design, participants called for consistency within each university on how placements work, and that be aligned with work integrated learning quality frameworks. Just one example of a solution related to inclusive practices is that we had a great discussion about the possibility of assessing the cultural safety of a workplace. So that could be by providing incoming students with feedback from previous students, as well as a set of evidence from the site around their policies and around their actual staff experiences. And finally, flexible placements such as part-time placements were recommended as particularly helpful for students with disabilities and who have caring responsibilities. We also talked about how we would like to communicate these solutions, and one common suggestion was to create some short videos. So together with Samuel Suresh, we have created 2 videos to start with, and I'd like to just have a go. Hopefully this will play at showing this first one. I do apologise that this doesn't have captions, but I think Anna's putting the link to the actual YouTube video into the chat, and I'll give you the link at the end as well, where you'll be able to see a captioned version.
I would define placement poverty as poverty put onto someone due to the placement they're about to go on.
I'd say it's financial hardships faced by students whilst conducting a placement from the university degree. Usually placements are unpaid for university students. There's a few exceptions, but mostly they're unpaid.
Placement poverty is where students are on their full-time compulsory placements in lots of degrees like nursing, teaching, social work, speech pathology, occupational therapy, dentistry, medicine. And when they're on their full-time long placements, they have to give up usually their part-time jobs. So they're not bringing in any money.
A system in place that is supposed to be one size fits all, like they assume that students are coming in, they have a support that allows them to go on placements for like a couple weeks at a time, maybe from somewhere else, and be able to like pay for all those like pocket expenses and also lose money.
When you go on placement, you're expected to go, you have to do this mandatory amount of hours. For my degree, it's 1,000 hours of unpaid work. Cannot be paid for it. For some degrees, you're not even allowed to work a normal job while you're on placement. So 1,000 hours of unpaid work.
To go a lot of international students in my workshop, and I'm talking about how they got a place in a war placement and they had to pay double rent and they couldn't actually find accommodation.
Sometimes they have to move as well, so they have to go to another location, so they have to leave their rental accommodation and actually pay for accommodation somewhere else, so there are those costs. So they're losing income, they're paying for extra accommodation, then they've got travel costs on top of that. And so for a lot of students, it's really, really hard to get there, and a lot of people really suffer under poverty in those situations, especially people that are already struggling prior to. So all of those costs mount up, and so when students are on their placements, they're losing a lot of money, and sometimes they have to go into debt while they're on placement. In my experience, a lot of people know about it, but there's a real big attitude of just pulling your bootstraps up and getting along with it. A lot of people thinking that I suffered, so you should suffer too, and I just don't think that that's okay.
A lot of the students are either first and family doing university, first generation immigrants, second generation immigrants, working class, maybe even middle class families. It's something that they have to consider when doing this stuff. So that's why placement poverty is something that needs to be addressed.
So what we've done in this project is a series of co-design workshops with students and educators from all kinds of degrees, all kinds of universities all across Australia, and together we've come up with about 20 solutions for placement poverty, ranging from kind of small scale things to really large scale ambitious ideas like industry or government paying students when they go on placement.
In a broader context, what we can do is we can definitely find a way to maybe create some standardization, like across all placements, and have maybe like better support systems in place for the student.
And universities making their scholarships and bursaries really easy for students to understand and find and apply for. Maybe even make them automatic for students who qualify without the students having to navigate complex processes.
So in the workshop participants, they mentioned there's more scholarships and bursaries and financial support for international students.
And with that, and there's also resource shortages, and with that becomes like a very complex issue. And I think students experience like the most burden when it comes to all of this.
I guess to these people that can make changes and that can make decisions, very hard for them, I think, to understand what it's like to be a student in safe circumstances, experiencing placement poverty and stuff. And I think for the people that can make change, when you're doing this sort of stuff, try to consider the student in mind, the students. What would I do if I was in their situation? And go from there.
Thank you, and thanks for bearing with the echoey sound. It was quite an immersive initial experience. And I just realised the idea about automation of financial support will definitely need to discuss the privacy implications with Brett at some stage. So with all of these solutions and the huge amount of data that we collected through the workshops, I've aimed to put together some kind of overarching recommendations. So the first is that partnership is a key way for everyone involved in placements to discuss and understand and eventually overcome systemic barriers. So this project, by involving students from equity deserving cohorts together with university and placement educators, demonstrates that it is a productive approach to co-developing solutions, and also that including students in these partnerships to tackle placement inequities helps balance the uneven power dynamics between students and educators by giving students a platform to suggest solutions. And an added benefit of involving students as co-researchers is that it helps them develop research skills, communication skills, networking skills, as well as changed perspectives. We also need a critical and more evidence-based approach so that we can create fairer and less onerous work-integrated learning models. So we need to question all of our underlying assumptions and accepted ways of doing things. So one example is that students often perceive work-integrated learning as work, as labour, rather than learning. So many student participants in the workshops did experience their placements as work, and that they were sometimes used to fill staffing gaps, and that's echoed in the literature as well. So students' experiences of placement as work has informed advocacy around this issue, and the efforts towards paid placements. So at a rally I attended in April last year, there were these signs that say all work should be paid, end unpaid placements. So while university educators may think of and position work-integrated learning as learning, we need to understand that's not often the student experience or perception. So Bex Howes from Paid Placements at Aotearoa has suggested viewing placements as paid training rather than paid work. So that may be one way out of this conundrum. The third recommendation is that financial support is, clearly the most direct way of addressing placement poverty. So from federal and state governments, from universities, and from for-profit employers. So while the prac payments are a really positive step, many degrees with compulsory placements are excluded and international students are not eligible. So we recommend expanding government funding, increasing financial support from for-profit industries, and strengthening university support schemes. And all of these funding initiatives need to be really easy for the students to find and apply for, because if you work in a university like I do, you see these kind of announcements all the time. Oh, there's a scholarship here, there's this scheme over there. It's really a lot for students to navigate, so it needs to be a lot more streamlined and easy to apply for. Universities and placement sites really need to look at ways to provide flexible placements like part-time schedules or shorter days. So these help alleviate placement poverty indirectly, because students can still keep their part-time paid work and still go on their placement. And it also supports students with caring responsibilities, with disability or other health issues. So our workshop participants suggested a few different models for this. So it could be part-time placements, shorter days, online placements, and shorter placements overall, with a reduced focus on a set number of hours or days and more of a focus on achieving competencies. Participants also suggested more recognition of current and past work towards placement. Taking a whole of degree approach to inclusive work integrated learning means that students are gradually prepared for placement throughout their studies. So this includes embedding inclusive practices into the pedagogy of educators and also into the practices of the professional staff who lead, for example, disability accommodations. A strengths-based approach should guide this process and help students and educators recognise students' unique strengths and how to apply them during placements and in their future careers. And this approach should extend to placement sites and placement educators, supporting them to create inclusive environments such as LGBTQIA+ friendly, neurodiverse affirming, disability accessible and culturally safe spaces. Our findings highlight that work integrated learning works best when it's well resourced and when everyone involved is well supported. So when resources, systems and people are overstretched, everyone's going to have a poor experience. So if staff are well supported in their placement education roles, that creates a climate where they can feel free to suggest solutions and to have time to act on them. So that's why WIL needs real investment. It is a very expensive form of education, and it needs to include a recognition of the relational work that makes it all possible. So we need enough staff. We need those staff to be compensated. We need strong support systems to prevent staff burnout. And just as importantly, we need increased student wellbeing support, like increased counselling services. So our final recommendation is that we kind of continue this momentum so that everyone who's involved in placement inclusion efforts just keep sharing. There's so many people working across this. I already knew of some, but found many more during the course of this project. We wanted to develop the WIL Work Integrated Learning Equity Collective as one way of doing this. So if you would like to, please do join us. We're available on Instagram, YouTube, where we've got those videos, LinkedIn, or feel free to email me. It's really important to have research alongside advocacy efforts, because it helps translate research to a wider audience. And yeah, I hope it's not too cheeky to suggest that you join us here. Feel free to start your own groups as well, but this is just one way of continuing the momentum of the project. So I just wanted to finish with some thank yous. So I wanted to thank my expert reference group, so Kylie Austin, Christine Morley, typesetter, and Isaac Wattenberg. My mentor, Kathy Stone, who's here. Thank you so much, Kathy. You've been really amazing. The ACSES team, of course, it's just been such a fantastic experience and I felt supported the whole way. The ACSES fellows, we were on this unknown journey together and you've been amazing. And most of all to the workshop participants, because you were really the heart of the project and it couldn't have happened without you. So thank you very much.
Thank you again, Amani. Clearly a very important topic and great findings and recommendations about what the sector and institutions can do. I suppose I'll start with a high-level question, and that's about placements in general, because I sort of remember 20 years ago, placements within the university degree was less common than it is now, and that for a lot of the type of placements we would see today, they usually was something that the employer provided after the university degree was actually completed. Do you share that perspective, and do you think that there's a chance that the sector could actually try to, I feel like it's become more common because industry has tried to shift the cost of training to within university systems?
Yeah, so I was looking only at degrees with compulsory placements, which are the professional accredited degrees where placements are part of the degrees. But if you go back historically, it was, for example, nursing and teaching way back, it was a lot more integrated. So it was the training happened on site, in the hospital, and it was paid and there was free or very low cost accommodation and meals. And it did shift into that university model. And I agree with you, Ian, there is a big move towards a lot of work integrated learning, which happens during the degrees rather than that happening after graduation. I'm not sure how we shift. Be pretty unpopular with industry, I imagine, to suggest that some of that be pushed back until after graduation, but it was definitely something that was suggested during the workshops.
Thanks, Amani. We will move to the questions on Slido. Was there any consensus in the workshops about who should pay for the placements?
It was just the ones that I suggested, so that, no, there was not one place that it should be funded. So the federal funding was obviously very welcomed and acknowledged, but there's also a place for state government to get involved. In many cases they have. So I know in New South Wales, where I'm from, there are scholarships in New South Wales Health and New South Wales Education. In other places, I think there's free or very low cost degrees to attract students into professions with workforce shortages. So federal, state universities do already provide bursaries and so on, but there could be more. And then there was an acknowledgement that employers ideally should help as well, as long as they were for profit. That was seen as probably impossible for not-for-profit industry.
Great, thanks, Amani. Are there any of your recommendations to placement inclusion that Sydney Uni is taking up as yet?
Oh, that's a good question. No, this is all just fresh, hot off the press. I haven't really even had a chance to tell people at Sydney Uni about all of this. It's literally only just come together in the last couple of weeks. But yes, I very much hope so.
Great. The assumption that you can afford to do the placement, that's in quotes, how transparent and accurate are in their recruitment? Could the ACCC force them to be?
Tricky question. I'm not sure how much students know about placements and their costs before they start the degree. I think unless someone has told them, like a family member, or, they get really transparent advice on the open day or something. I don't think students go in with a lot of knowledge about the costs of placements. I'm not sure how we can force.
Or even the cost of degrees. One of my ACSES colleagues has been looking at how easy it is to find the cost of university degrees, and short answer is not that easy.
not easy, and there's not a lot of transparency. Even like the number of Commonwealth supported places within a master's degree is quite unclear how that all happens and which students get them. Yeah.
So that's definitely an area that the sector needs to actually do better in as well.
Yes.
Cost of placements, be really transparent, be upfront, and don't make that assumption, because true enough, the ACCC might force you to swallow that assumption someday.
Even on a really small level, things like for disability accommodation, some workshop participants spoke about needing to continually reprove that. And just even things like, well, that means I have to go back to the doctor, and that's going to cost me $70 and my time, and go on the waiting list to get into the doctor. And I've got a genetic condition, so, why should I have to keep reproving that? So there's even small hidden costs that we don't tell students about.
That's a great point, Amani. Next question. How do we engage better with accreditation bodies to get them to think about, for example, why is 1,000 hours the magic number? Do you think that there is a general openness within accreditation bodies to revisit these issues, or is it very discipline specific?
I think there is a willingness to revisit these issues. So I know social work has been looking at it, and the other disciplines as well. It is discipline by discipline because they have their own professional bodies. But yes, there is a willingness, and it's directly linked to one of the Accord recommendations.
Great. Thanks, Amani. That was the last question, unless there were any other questions people wanted to pose on Slido. Oh, that's okay. Great. There's actually 2 that came in, and I'll come back to you. There's actually quite a few that's come in. Was there any discussion about improving the accessibility of core competencies assessment for students with disabilities?
Yes, so there were some really rich discussions. It's hard to cover, like my fellows, it's quite hard to cover the richness of the discussions that we had. So wait for the 100-page report to come out. But yes, we did discuss things like inherent requirements of certain degrees. And one participant said, we haven't looked at those for 10, 20 years. They really need an update. Some of them just seem really out of date and not in line with current practices around disability inclusion. Yeah. So
the comment from Sally, Shamit's question regarding the ACCC, the Productivity Commissioner said that if higher education was an actual industry, you would be required to have a product disclosure statement. Did I butcher that comment too much? So if higher education, given the finances that's involved, will be required to have an actual product disclosure statement. And that's something my ACSES colleagues have brought up. We have PDSs for pet insurance, given the amounts that's involved in higher education and the lack of transparency that's actually present in the sector. Why do we not have the same sort of financial standards that's being
brought? And I know Bex Howells in Aotearoa, who I mentioned before, has just published, and it's worth looking up, the long-term impacts of placement costs versus paid trading. So I think it might have been contrasted with things like police, and just the long-term impacts, like how long it takes you to kind of catch up. And there was a really big difference between paid training and unpaid. So that kind of assumption that university quickly sets you up for financial success is not necessarily the case at all.
That's right. Would developing a student feedback system with a placement be helpful?
Yes, and many universities already have this. So I know in the units that I work in, students give feedback after every placement, but it's what happens with that afterwards. So some of the placement site educators in the workshop said, well, I've never seen that feedback, so how can I act on that? So there needs to be better closing the loop so that we actually act on that feedback, that we're really transparent about it, let the students know about it as well.
Students should go on strike regarding placement poverty. Thoughts?
Yeah, so if you follow Students Against Placement Poverty on their Instagram, they've got a range of, they've had protests, petitions. The Australian Medical Students Association that I showed earlier, that was a petition. So there's definitely different efforts going on led by students for sure.
And I suppose very tongue-in-cheek, they should go on hunger strike because it's happening anyway for lots of them on placements.
You can't end on that note, Ian.
Sorry. Any other questions? Okay, there's one more that's coming through and we do have a bit of time, so. No pressure. But clearly there's a lot that needs to be done. Sorry?
Yeah,
You want me to hand you
definitely
okay.
the food issue is huge. It came up a lot. So students really appreciated the food pantries and initiatives on campus, but when they're on placement, they can't access them. So things like a food voucher would be very helpful for when they're on placement.
Yeah. Do universities compete with each other regarding their placement policies?
I'm not sure, but maybe they should. So I know there's one example in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where they're developing a really fantastic occupational therapy degree with industry. So I think there's definitely room for universities to distinguish themselves with things like apprenticeship style degrees, for sure.
And the next question, I'm not sure whether it's actually more for me or for you, or it has now been edited to be for you. Is there anything ACSES can do on this issue from your view, Amani? And we are listening.
I mean, I guess they funded this fellowship, right? Which was fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, just keep going, keep up the momentum, make big or small changes at your universities. Just keep the topic alive would be fantastic.
Yeah, and we will certainly be supporting you in the dissemination and translation of the research as well. Last one is more of a comment. I'm looking forward to seeing all those wonderful fellowship reports. Actually, another 2 questions just came in. No letting you go off easily, Amani. I assume this is an issue that affects students from all universities. Do universities ever work together to look at this?
I mean, I think, again, this fellowship was one way that we had so many different universities involved in the workshop. So yes, we should do more together, collaboratively, collectively. Yeah.
Have you looked at the UK degree apprenticeship model?
Yes, we did. That was definitely highlighted in a literature review paper as a possible model. It's not without its flaws. So in our review, we did find things like they were maybe meant to be for students from equity deserving backgrounds, but sometimes it was current employees that got those opportunities rather than bringing in new people into the company. But I think overall they were felt to be a good thing.
Great. Thank you very much, Amani. We are going to let you go despite the flurry of questions that keep coming in. Thank you very much for the fellowship, dissemination of findings, and also for the great Q&A from everyone. Let's thank Amani